In today's episode, another high-altitude tragedy for Boeing, but this time it did not involve a plane. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. On the afternoon of Thursday, July 1st, 2010, Don Storm Jr. and Trevor Lane walked into the ranger station at Camp Muir on Mount Rainier. The two mountain climbers were there to report that their friend, 57-year-old Eric Lewis of Duvall, Washington, had simply vanished from the mountain. And this wasn't your everyday missing persons report. Camp Muir sits at over 10,100 feet in elevation, high on the slopes of the tallest mountain in the Cascades Range. Furthermore, the guys weren't on just some sort of simple hiking trip. They were attempting to reach the summit of Mount Rainier, which sits at over 14,410 feet. When Eric was last seen, the group was at over 13,800 feet in elevation. Lewis was also attached to the same rope as both Storm and Lane, but when those two men reached the 13,900 foot mark, Eric did not appear. Tugging on his section of rope, they were able to reel it up to find that Eric's butterfly knot was there, but the man himself was nowhere to be found. So far as they could tell, Eric had unclipped himself from the rope sometime in the last several minutes, though for what reason was completely unclear. The ensuing search involved dozens of climbers, 2 helicopters, and a couple of very strange but ultimately fruitless clues. To this day, Lewis has not been found and is presumed dead, one of at least 84 people to lose their lives to the mountain. And amongst those 84 people are 2 other men, Joseph Wood Jr. and Lowell Lin. All 3 of these disappearances, as well as 1 live recovery, are grouped together into what David Paulides calls the Mount Rainier Missing 411 cluster. My goal going into research this supposed cluster of missing 411 cases was to determine a few things. Were these actually connected? Was there any possibility that it was foul play? Could there be a reasonable explanation for any of it? And, perhaps most mysteriously, why did Eric Lewis unclip himself from that rope? But one thing I did know is that whatever the outcome of the research would be, it all started with Mount Rainier. And of course, when I say background, this is the Lore Lodge, so that means you're about to get a brief history segment. I'll tell you, this one's not one of our longest, so I hope you'll stick around for it, but if not, feel free to skip to the next chapter where we start the actual missing person stuff. That said, in this episode, the history segment is a lot less tangential. It's more directly related to the story at hand, so you might enjoy what you're going to get. Of course, some of you may be wondering why there's a history segment at all. Part of it is that I'm a historian, and I enjoy doing history, and I enjoy sharing history. I feel like a lot of people don't get to learn history the way that it should be taught. And this format allows me to do that. I can make it fun, and I can look into the stuff that's interesting, not the stuff you need to learn for a test. Of course, another aspect of being a historian is the fact that I'm supposed to know multiple languages, usually at least 2, and while I used to be pretty proficient at German back in high school, that's kind of fallen off as I've had fewer and fewer reasons to practice the language. And as an adult learner, it's difficult to find classes that fit my schedule or to find other people to practice the language with. And that's why I like our partner for today's video, Babbel. Babbel teaches you foreign languages not in a textbook format, but through conversations. You're not going to be sitting there learning the individual parts of speech and building your vocabulary from a workbook. You're going to be doing it by learning how different conversational topics function. Rather than memorizing a list of words that begin with the same letter or revolve around the same topic, you're going to learn how to ask questions like where is the bathroom or wo ist die Toilette? Essentially, Babbel teaches you how to use a foreign language, not just how to comprehend it. You're going to be learning full useful phrases such as kann ich die Rechnung haben? Or, in plain English, can I have the check? Now, I will tell you, a German teacher I had in high school, who is apparently banned from Poland, did tell me that you don't really ask for the check by saying, can I have the check? You just raise your hand and yell, ich bezahlen. It means I pay, or I think more literally pay. From what I understand, German is a more straightforward language. Now, of course, if you're German and you're sitting here going, well, that's wrong, don't take my word for it, I could be wrong, but that's what a teacher told me. How did he get banned from Poland, you ask? That's not my story to tell. But really the most important thing that Babbel offers is the opportunity to practice your language. Because to be perfectly honest with you, I think I'm more proficient in reading Old English right now than I am in speaking German. And that's weird because it was initially my knowledge of German that aided me in reading Old English. If you'd like to give Babbel a shot, you can get 60% off your subscription by clicking the link in our description or in our pinned comment. Your subscription will get you access to one of the top language learning apps in the world, and if you're American, it might help us reduce that stereotype that we only speak English. And in the realm of only speaking English, it's time to get back to that background section on Mount Rainier, which it has a non-English name. Mount Rainier is 14,411 feet tall itself, making it the 31st tallest peak in North America, but its prominence of 13,210 feet sets it apart as the fourth most prominent peak on the continent, and the most prominent in the lower 48. In topography, prominence is the difference between the height of one peak and the surrounding terrain, whereas elevation is how high it is above sea level. The mountain features prominently in the tradition of the Coast Salish peoples of the region, who generally refer to it by some variant of Tacoma or Tahoma. In English, the translation of the term would be snow-covered mountain. As for the Coast Salish themselves, they were and are the dominant Native American ethnic and cultural group of the Seattle to Vancouver general area. While archaeological evidence confirms a human presence in the Salish territories going back to at least 6500 BC, it's possible and even likely that the area was inhabited much earlier than that, but that their remains were all swept away by the glacial melts. One cultural clue suggesting that these people were here a very, very long time ago is a Squamish oral tradition about a great flood. That flood was survived by a lone family and a number of good animals who made their way to the top of Mount Rainier at the urging of the Great Spirit. This could be a cultural memory of the melting of the Cordilleran ice sheet around 12,500 to 14,000 years ago. Though it should also be noted that there are multiple similarities to the story of Noah's Ark held within this tradition. Also, if there's anybody watching the video who is more experienced in anthropology, geology, those kinds of things than I am, and I said Cordilleran ice sheet wrong, please get me, just correct me. I will appreciate it, and I will get it right next time. In any case, as the story goes, the Great Spirit decides that he wants to get rid of all of the bad animals and the bad people, and he chooses a flood to do this. However, his goal is not to completely wipe out humanity or even life on Earth. His goal is to just get rid of the bad and rebuild with the good. So he selects one good man, and he tells him to fire an arrow up at the top of Rainier. And he does. And then the Great Spirit says, all right, now fire another one into the back of that arrow. Also, I keep saying fire, I know it's loose, I hate myself. And the man proceeds to do this with literally thousands of arrows until eventually they've formed something of a climbing rope up to the peak. The good man, his family, and all of the animals begin to climb their way up the rope, but as they're doing so, the Great Spirit causes it to rain. Because it's raining, all of the bad animals and the bad people start trying to follow the good man up the rope, so the Great Spirit tells him that he needs to cut it as soon as he gets to the top. He does, and all of the bad people and bad animals fall back to the ground. After that point, it rains for many days and many nights, and eventually the water rises up to the snow line of Rainier. As a result, only those people atop the mountain survived this flood, and it was they who rebuilt the world. Another one of these oral traditions regarding Mount Rainier, or Mount Tacoma in the languages of the Salish peoples themselves, comes from the Puyallup people. Again, if that is wrong, tell me, I will fix it. One version of this story, which was recorded by Professor Elliot E. Clark back in the 1950s, comes from a individual who says that in the time of his grandmother's grandfather, a prophecy was given. I have to say, I'm unsure if the grandfather and grandmother here are actual paternal or maternal grandparents, or if this is the more cultural term of grandfather used to refer to an elder. In any case, what's being said here is that this occurred 5 to 6 generations before the story was recorded, so sometime in the 1800s, possibly the very, very late 1700s. As the story goes, this grandfather spent an evening by a lake high up on Mount Rainier, and while there, he encountered a spirit. In a lot of Salish folklore and their understanding of the spiritual world, there are spirits of everything. It's kind of similar to Shinto, but the idea would be that the trees, the rivers, the mountains, they all have a spirit of their own, and the spirit of the mountain spoke to this man. The story of his ascent up the mountain describes him using elk horns to cut steps into the snow and ice, which suggests that he was going up a glacial route and was therefore very high up on the mountain. As for the prophecy, it was foretold that when the man grew old, moss would grow out of his body, and then when he passed away, the head of the mountain would burst, and the lake he had stayed by would just flood down it. Many years later, the man did grow old. The story says that moss did grow from his body, and when he died, that lake did spill down the mountainside. The story even suggests that the amount of water was such that it just wiped out trees all down the western slope. This one is almost certainly a much more recent memory, and it does kind of sound like maybe a massive glacial break. Departing from the oral tradition and going into the archaeology of the Salish, they appear to have developed out of the Marpole culture, which existed from around 400 BC to about 480. Then, over the course of the next 1500 or so years, the Coast Salish evolved into the people we know them as today. The genesis of the modern Salish culture, what brought it out of the Marpole culture, may have been the development of complex social stratification within individual Salish bands and tribes. At the time of European contact, the Coast Salish occupied the Pacific Northwest from Baker Bay to the Strait of Georgia, though they did remain a semi-nomadic society which migrated in accordance to a 13-month lunar calendar. While there was no centralized government between the various bands and tribes, it does seem that they, in some way, managed to decide who had rights to what territory. And this was not necessarily for any kind of political reasoning, but to make sure that everybody had enough food. Tribes also varied in hierarchy structure and kinship practices, though it seems that in general, you had the men leading the village and the women leading the household. Kinship was typically matrilineal, but certain bands and tribes practiced a dual system, much like our modern system. And part of the reason this worked so well is that leadership of the tribe was not hereditary. You didn't have a chief pass the title down to his son. It was meritocratic. People followed who was worthy of being followed. The meritocracy of the leadership role, however, did not necessarily mean that everything was a meritocracy. Within Coast Salish society, there was a class system, even if it wasn't the most clearly defined thing. Still, some families had wealth, some were working class, and others still were actually enslaved. One thing I did find very interesting about the Coast Salish is that spiritually they're something of an enigma, as much of their legends do resemble Christian scripture. As a result, it's often difficult to tell what is original to their mythology and what is a result of syncretism with Christianity. You know, is the Skokomish story of one good man who was selected to survive the Great Flood original? Is it a combination of Old Salish tradition and the Christian Noah's Ark story? Or is it pure and simple just the Christians giving the natives their own version of Noah's Ark? We may never actually know, but what we do know is that the first men to summit Mount Rainier in recorded history were actually led there by a Native American guide named Sluiskin. Sluiskin guided the 1870 expedition of Hazard Stevens and P.B. Van Trump as they attempted to summit the mountain, but as the story goes, and nobody's really sure which exact tribe or band this man belonged to, a lot have claimed him, but as the story goes, as they got closer and closer to the snow line, he became more and more nervous, and when they finally reached the snow line itself, he refused to go any further, telling Hazard Stevens and P.B. Van Trump that people who go up to the top of the mountain are never seen again. They're thrown into a lake of fire by demons. Stevens and Van Trump ultimately did summit, beginning a long tradition of mountain climbing on what is actually a dormant volcano. That whole lake of fire thing makes a lot more sense now, doesn't it? Not long after, in 1888, the famed Scottish-American naturalist John Muir summited, but he claimed that it was better appreciated from the bottom. Despite that review, the National Park Service did name a camp high on the mountain after John Muir, Camp Muir, and it was from that camp that Eric Lewis and his friends set out for their summit attempt on that fateful July day. Eric Lewis was no stranger to mountain climbing, and especially not with Rainier, having summited it 10 times. And while I'm always cautious about using David Paulides as a source, he does make the claim that Eric had summited mountains on 4 different continents. For those unfamiliar with or lacking understanding regarding my wariness in terms of David Paulides, it's mostly due to my reviews of these cases that I feel this way. Paulides has a tendency to omit relevant information, get details wrong, or make uncorroborated claims. This video is actually going to go over a lot of those discrepancies, but one example in this very case is that on July 1st, 2010, he claimed that the mountain had great weather, that it was looking like a good climb. In reality, everywhere above Camp Muir that day was experiencing 40-mile-an-hour winds and only 10 feet of visibility. Paulides did later get it right, but suggested that the bad weather and poor visibility rolled in while they were on the mountain. Like I said, it was there at Camp Muir. According to the contemporary reporting, most climbers on the mountain that day chose to remain inside at Camp Muir rather than continuing up the mountain. So Eric Lewis, Don Storm, and Trevor Lane were definitely knowingly heading into rough conditions. In any case, the group was taking the Gibraltar Ledges group to the summit, a climb of 4,306 feet over around 3 miles in terms of lateral movement. This route follows the same path that Hazard Stevens and P.B. Van Trump took in 1870 and is currently rated a Grade 2 climb using the U.S. system. Lewis's group set off from about 10,100 feet at Camp Muir. They then proceeded up the western edge of the Cowlitz Glacier to the Beehive at 10,800 feet. The Beehive is a rock formation. From there, they made their way up to Camp Misery at 11,600 feet, and this is where the ledges part of the Gibraltar Ledges route comes into play. I also found this a little funny because we have a Mount Misery very nearby and it is nowhere near as tall. That said, I did have to run up and down it for rugby practice in high school, and Misery was the right name.
And believe it or not, Mount Misery is the mountain that I grew up on.
Wait, is it really?
Yeah.
That explains a lot. Anyway, after reaching Camp Misery, they began to scale the rocky, exposed ledges on the side of the outcropping known as Gibraltar Rock until they reached the top of the Gibraltar Chute. The upper Gibraltar Chute itself is a snowy slope of about 40 to 50 degrees that sits basically at 12,000 feet. They climbed the chute until they came to Camp Comfort, which is on top of Gibraltar Rock, at around 12,600 feet. For the record, I don't think either Camp Misery or Camp Comfort are actual campsites. From what I understand, they're named for the Ingram expedition back in the late 1800s. What's interesting is that from this point at the top of Gibraltar Rock, it should have been relatively smooth sailing the rest of the way up. At these elevations, the inclines become far less aggressive, and you're mostly making your way through snow rather than climbing up rocks. At 13,900 feet, however, something went wrong. All three men had clipped themselves to loops in the same stretch of rope. Using this rope, they followed a staggered climbing method where the lead man, Don Storm Jr. in this case, would climb a ways, stop, help the middle man, Trevor Lane in this case, up, and then Don Storm Jr. would have been resting, while Trevor Lane helped Eric Lewis up. This may have been because Eric Lewis was the least fit member of the group and therefore might have required the most help getting up. By having two climbers ahead of him, they both could have pulled on his rope if he became stuck, if he became too tired, or if anything else had happened. Lane, on the other hand, would have only been able to call on the assistance of Storm. However, when they hit that 13,900 foot mark, Storm stopped, helped Lane up, and when Lane went to help Lewis up, he found that the rope was oddly slack. The two men proceeded to reel in the rope, only to find that at the end of it was Eric Lewis's butterfly knot, but there was no Eric Lewis. The two men immediately realized that Eric must have unclipped himself for some reason, and decided to descend down to where they had last seen him just minutes before, but Eric Lewis was nowhere to be found. Storm and Lane would have, in that very moment, been well aware of how serious this situation was, because climbers do not unclip themselves, especially at that altitude, unless there is an emergency or something that could endanger the other climbers. Recognizing the severity of the situation, but also aware that Eric was an extremely experienced climber, Storm and Lane decided that rather than descend now, they would see if he had somehow skirted them and gotten to the summit. They went up to the summit ridge, they looked for Eric, but they could not find him. Knowing that this was a situation they could not handle alone, Storm and Lane then proceeded down the mountain to Camp Muir, where they asked the Rangers for help. Due to the late hour, a formal search and rescue attempt would have to wait until the morning, but that did not stop climbing ranger Tom Payne and two mountaineering guides from trying their best to go up that mountain and locate Eric Lewis. Payne led his crew up the mountain to the location at which Eric was last seen in just a few hours. Arriving at the summit ridge around 8 p.m., they still could find no trace of Eric, so they had to return back down the mountain, getting back to the camp at around 10 p.m. I will say, aside from what the Rangers recorded, it's a little difficult to tell what the timeline is here. It's unclear if they started at Camp Muir or if they started at the bottom of the mountain. Some hikers do this as a 2-day trip, where the first day they go up to the camp, the second day they summit and come down. Some do it all in one go. It's pretty unclear which option the Lewis group went with. The search began in earnest early on the morning of Friday, July 2nd, with rangers and climbing guides ascending the mountain on foot, while a National Guard Chinook and a privately chartered helicopter also scanned the area. Climbers from the National Park Service were aided by professional guides from Alpine Ascent International, Rainier Mountaineering, International Mountain Guides, and a number of volunteers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue Organization who spread out across the slopes of the mountain. Several groups were dispatched to the Gibraltar Ledges route, but aware of Eric's experience with the mountain, other groups were tasked with searching areas he might have diverted to. One group checked the Emmons route, which runs up the northeastern slopes of the mountain, while another checked the Ingram route on the southeast slopes. The Emmons team was made up of National Park Service rangers from Camp Sherman, while the Ingram Glacier route was made up of Alpine Ascent's International team members. Both groups agreed that they would search their respective routes and then meet up at Disappointment Cleaver somewhere in the middle. While those two groups searched the eastern slopes of the mountain, the team selected to search the Gibraltar Ledges route came across the first evidence of Eric Lewis's presence. At 13,600 feet, they found the missing climber's backpack, which still contained his frozen water bottles, his climbing harness, and a snow shovel, but he himself was nowhere to be found. 200 feet further up the mountain, just below where it was first noticed that Eric was missing, searchers also were able to find a small snow cave, presumably dug by Eric Lewis. It's not entirely relevant, but for some reason, Paulides attributes this discovery to Storm and Lane, when I'm unsure if they were even involved in the search. A further effort spanned the western side of the volcanic rim atop the mountain, but that was ultimately fruitless. By day's end, the only thing that the searchers knew was that Eric was now without supplies, as everything he had was in his backpack. Day 3, Saturday, July 3rd, 2010, was a more focused search, as basically everywhere else that Eric could have been had been searched on day 2. So this time, the efforts were focused on the Nisqually Glacier and the icefall associated with it, with rangers skiing the bottom of the Gibraltar Chute as helicopters circled overhead, looking for any trace of Eric Lewis. At this point, they knew that they were basically on a recovery mission rather than a rescue attempt, as without any supplies, it was nearly impossible that Lewis had survived 2 nights on the mountain. They expected that if they were to recover him specifically in this area of the mountain, they likely would have been finding him dead from a fall. Unfortunately, they found absolutely no trace of the man, and with a storm front rolling in, they made the hard decision to suspend the search, as it simply posed too much danger to those looking, and the likelihood Eric was still alive was essentially at 0. To this day, nobody has located the body of Eric Lewis, and nobody really knows what happened on that fateful afternoon. With so little information to go on and no body recovered, this case has seen a lot of theories develop. Everything from foul play to Bigfoot, and then of course there's the mainstream narrative about what happened. All of that said, David Paulides thinks that he may be onto something, and he thinks that Eric Lewis may not be the only relevant disappearance. In Missing 401, North America and Beyond, Paulides outright rejects the possibility of an accident, writing, "I find it almost unbelievable that Eric unhooked from a safety line and vanished." Now, while Paulides never explicitly blames Bigfoot in any of his books, Missing 401 has always carried something of a connotation that Bigfoot is involved, and this story is no different. I won't go into depth about why I say that. We do have a video on the Missing 401 phenomenon where we analyzed it, we looked at a number of different cases, went back, did a meta-analysis of our own research, and then came to some conclusions. I would recommend watching that if you want to get the full story on why we're where we are. In terms of the Eric Lewis case, he doesn't go into any detail trying to prove Bigfoot's involvement, and without context, you might even think he's just suggesting foul play. The key is his decision to include 3 other cases from Mount Rainier for which Eric's friends can't have been responsible. Of the 4 Mount Rainier cases mentioned in Missing 401 North America and Beyond, the most recent is that of Joseph Wood Jr. Wood disappeared July 8th, 1999. Before we launch into that, I want to go over the structure of how I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you David Paulides' version of the stories, and then I'm going to give you some clarifications that I found during my research because they are important. At the time of his disappearance, the Baychester, New York native was 34 years old and working for a publishing company in the city. Also an Eagle Scout, Wood should have been well trained in wilderness survival. The reason he was in the Pacific Northwest in the first place here was that he was attending a Minorities in Journalism conference in Seattle. Because he was a hobbyist bird watcher, he decided he would take a day trip down to Mount Rainier to go and see the sights. He passed through the park's Nisqually entrance at 12:29 p.m. and then proceeded to park in the Longmire lot. From there, Paulides says that he went up the Rampart Ridge Trail, where he was last seen at around 4,800 feet. That sighting was confirmed by hiker Bruce Gaumond, with Gaumond allegedly telling Wood the trail terminated just 5 to 10 minutes further up due to the ice and the snow, and that there was an unstable snow bridge that would have prevented him from traveling any further. After this, Joseph Woods Jr. was never seen again. Of course, 1999 is recent enough to 2010 that theoretically Storm and Lane could have been responsible. The thing is, there's nothing to connect them to it, and on top of that, they can't have been behind the other 2. I say that because the next most recent missing person, Lowell Lin, was 23 years old when he disappeared on November 31st, 1957. I'm going to assume that Paulides meant November 30th, as there is no November 31st, but in any case, the young Boeing engineer was hiking Mount Rainier to go skiing with his friend Harry Holcomb. They intended to snowshoe up and then ski their way down. The pair set off from Paradise Inn at 5,500 feet, then ascended to 7,500 feet before hitting the slopes. The plan for the trip down was to start at the top and then stop down at Panorama Point at 6,500 feet before making the final descent down to Paradise Inn at 5,500. However, when Holcomb reached that 6,500 foot mark and stopped to wait, Lowell Lin did not appear. After waiting for several more minutes and seeing no sign of his friend, Holcomb decided that he would just go on down to Paradise Inn and wait there where he wasn't, on a mountain in the cold. The problem was that even a couple of hours later, Lin hadn't shown up, and with a storm rolling in, Holcomb decided he needed to alert the Rangers. Unfortunately, despite a considerable effort, no clues were found, so the search had to be suspended 2 days later on December 2nd. To this day, the body of Lowell Lin has never been found. The third and final example given was that of Marcella Ramisky, a 5-year-old who disappeared from a picnic at Chenoweth Falls on July 1st, 1950. It's also by far the most Bigfoot did it of all of them. According to Marcella's mother, Kay, sometime around 5 p.m., Marcella just vanished. It was early enough in the day, and it was at a pretty low elevation on the mountain, around 2,000 feet, so 50 rangers and 2 bloodhounds were dispatched to go and look for the little girl. Oddly enough, despite being given Marcella's scent, the dogs were unable to track the girl, and the rangers were unable to find any clues as to where she had gone. I am pleased, however, to tell you that this story actually does have a happy ending. Around 9 a.m. the next morning, 2 volunteer searchers by the names of Jack and Donald Noel managed to locate Marcella up on a ridge through their binoculars. She was about 2 miles uphill from where she and her mother had been having their picnic, and papers initially reported that she was covered in scrapes and bruises. However, as Politis notes, the odd thing is, later that day, they changed the story. Essentially, the witness statements reported by the Kingsport News said that she had cuts and scrapes all over, but the Rangers' statement given to the Nevada Journal said that she was completely unharmed. She was in good condition and had no injuries. He also tells us that the Kingsport News says that her dress was on backwards and her shoelaces were misarranged. Or at the very least, they weren't tied properly. The language isn't all that clear. As for the cuts and scrapes and why they would have been absent from the National Park's version of the story, he says that the Rangers know that's important. And finally, he suggests that it's impossible that she could have made it 2 miles uphill in just 16 hours on a warm July night. Now, Washington and Mount Rainier specifically do have their fair share of Bigfoot legends, and some of them are actually rather compelling, but we'll get to that later. In this set of cases, however, some clarifications are necessary, beginning with the story of Joseph Wood Jr. Politis wrote that Wood was last seen at 4,800 feet along the Rampart Ridge Trail, where it crosses Devil's Dream Creek as he headed for Mildred Point. One of the problems here is that Mildred Point is not along that route, and that's not the only issue. Reports from the time place him off, and I need to emphasize, he was off the Van Trump Trail. He was near it, but he was not on it. He was following the footprints of other hikers. So reports from the time place him off the Van Trump Trail, headed towards Mildred's Point and Comet Falls. And it was up that way that Bruce Gaumond had told him there was an unstable ice bridge and he probably shouldn't go any further. If we look at the map, you can see that where Politis said he was and where he actually was are extremely different locations. Finally, while Joseph Wood Jr.'s body was never recovered, Rangers did locate the unstable snow bridge mentioned by Bruce Gaumond, and it's generally believed that he fell off of it, fell into the creek, and was simply washed away by snowmelt. While these clues alone don't prove that Joseph Wood Jr. fell off of the snow bridge and died in a creek, it is a plausible explanation based on the evidence we have, and I only ever encourage people to look at the implausible if the plausible has been firmly ruled out. In this case, the plausible has in no way firmly been ruled out. In fact, it seems much more likely than the alternative. In the case of Lowell Lin, there were a number of incorrect details in Politis' accounting of events, and I will say I have to give credit to a Reddit user who unfortunately has deleted their account, so I can't say who it was, but who went through and did basically what I do with specifically this story. Like, they had their citations, their news articles, everything was laid out. It was really well done. It's just, unfortunately, I don't know who did it. But to summarize their findings, the main issues with David Politis' version were that Holcomb was the only one who planned to ski down. Lin had no plans to ski down the mountain. He always planned to just walk back down. He was along for the ride. He was not a skier himself. They also did not separate at 7,500 feet when they started to ski down. Obviously, since Lin wasn't skiing. They separated at 6,500 feet when Lin became ill and decided that he needed to start back then. At that point, Holcomb said, "I still want to ski down," and figured that he would just meet up with his friend back at the inn. This separation appears to have occurred around 10 a.m., and that's important because while David Paulides said that the storm blew in after Holcomb reached the bottom of the hill, that's not true. The storm was well on its way in, and they were in near blizzard conditions when they separated. And because Holcomb expected that Lin would take a little bit longer than he would, obviously due to skiing versus walking, he didn't report the missing person until noon. All of that also needs to be understood in the context that even at just 6,500 feet, there are already deep crevasses in the mountainside. With all of the evidence considered, the National Park Service came to the conclusion that the most likely outcome was, with all of the wind and the blinding snow, Lin got off course and fell into one of these fissures. Because snow was rapidly falling on the mountain, even if he had survived the fall, he would have quickly been covered and never seen. So, the two options here that we have are he was abducted by Bigfoot, or he fell into one of the crevasses we know exist. I personally, I am, as you guys probably know from watching our Bigfoot videos, I'm kind of agnostic on the existence of Bigfoot. I've been looking into it. I'm not sure how to feel. I have some thoughts on what Bigfoot is if it's real, and they usually kind of form around the it's people concept. But either way, one of these two things is much more likely than the other. So again, not proven that this was some tragic accident, but the story is a lot less mysterious than it was initially presented. Marcella Ramisky's story is quite similar. I mean, I'd like to start with the fact that a 5-year-old girl making it 2 miles in 16 hours in warm weather is not remotely unusual, impossible. It's totally feasible. This is not Keith Parkins. This is not freezing weather in 22 hours. This is 16 hours in warm weather on the side of a mountain in a very safe area. In addition to that, I can't find the Nevada Journal article that Paulides claims says she had no injuries whatsoever, and I can only find that Kingsport News article reprinted in other papers. That said, the Kingsport News article says that she had scrapes and bruises and that she was in remarkably good condition. I couldn't find a single article that said that she had no injuries whatsoever. They either said she had scrapes and cuts or that she was in good condition. Those are the only two things. Good condition is not perfect condition. As for how she went missing, she was not abducted. She quite plainly told her mother, remember this is a 5-year-old, this is not a baby. She quite plainly told her mother, "I saw a squirrel and I chased after it." She was even able to tell her mother that after getting lost, she went through her nightly routine, which seems to involve her getting undressed and then getting dressed again because her clothes were on backwards and her shoes were mistied. But, and then after she decided to get redressed for some reason, she slept in a tree. She said on a tree, so she probably meant that she slept against a tree, not in the branches, but point is, no evidence that anything weird happened there. Now, you may be thinking the exact same thing that went through my head when I heard her dress was on backwards and her shoelaces were wrong, which was a very, very dark place to go, but she showed no signs of trauma. She was talking normally, she was bubbly, she was happy, she was just excited she had been found. I'm not going to tell you that a child will openly tell you I was abused, but there are signs you can look for when those things happen. She displayed none of these signs. Granted, it was in 1950, so less advanced investigative practices, lesser understanding of abuse psychology, but based on the reports we have, there was no evidence, so we can't just assume that they missed something. I will say that the thing that did perplex me about this case was that the rangers and the dogs could not find her, but at the same time, if the dogs were unable to even catch her scent for some reason, which can happen, dogs are not 100% all the time. If they were unable to catch her tracks, or track her scent, the rangers would have no idea where to look, and 50 people over, 10 to 15 square miles is not a lot of people. Add to that we're talking about incredibly dense forest and varying terrain topography, it's not super unsurprising that she wasn't found. And once again, this is a case where the person was recovered, and the person did not mention Bigfoot, the person did not mention a hairy man, did not mention being cared for by a bear, just said, "I chased off after a squirrel, got lost, and the volunteers found me." Now, all of that said, had Marcella Ramisky said Bigfoot took me or anything of the sort, I would hear her out. If we look at the whole scope of what we have here, there are 4 people who disappeared, one of which was recovered without incident, all of which occurred at different altitudes, miles apart from one another, and none under particularly inexplicable circumstances. This isn't the case of Garrett Bardsley, who went missing in the 150 feet between his father and his Boy Scout troop on a rather bare mountain. All 4 of these cases occurred under conditions that you would almost expect there to be a risk. So, when it comes to the Eric Lewis case specifically, a somewhat more reasonable way of looking at it would be the foul play angle. It could be argued that Storm and Lane did reach the summit with Eric, at which point, for some reason or another, they decided to kill him, then take his gear, dig out a snow cave to make it look like he had climbed down the mountain himself, deposit his gear to make it so that there was a last known traceable location, and then climb down and say, oh no, our friend's gone. In terms of where they would have hidden the body, they could have thrown it into one of the steam caves at the top of the volcano, they could have thrown it into a crevasse. They really only would have to kind of shove it in any direction in order for people to assume there was an accident. The weirder part is that it wasn't found. But still, we have to remember there was a blizzard and the mountain is covered in crevasses and ridges, and there are places that you actually can't even get to. Helicopters might have just missed something. While none of that is impossible, and in fact, it's actually a pretty clever way to get rid of somebody if you really need to, and they're, I guess, willing to climb a mountain for some reason, there's no evidence that Storm and Lane did that. There's no reason to suspect that they wanted to get rid of Eric. So far as I can tell, neither of the men have a criminal history, neither of the men had any stake in Eric's assets, and Eric's family doesn't seem to believe that foul play was involved or that this is a mystery. That just leaves us with the official narrative, which is that somewhere around 13,800 feet, for some reason, Eric unclipped, went and dug himself a snow cave to get out of the elements, realized he needed to get back down the mountain, climbed down, decided he needed to drop some weight, and made his way into the great beyond, I guess. Most likely due to the low visibility, the high winds, the fact that he was alone and that he was not tethered to anything, he got disoriented and fell. So the mysterious part for me here is not that he wasn't found, it's not that he ditched his gear, it's not even the snow cave, it's why he unclipped in the first place. But that being a mystery doesn't necessarily mean that there's no plausible explanation or that something paranormal happened. If we look at it, Eric may have simply had a medical emergency. He was not in tip-top condition physically, he was 57 years old, and he was in an area with rather low oxygen doing a strenuous activity. He could have had a heart attack, he could have had a panic attack, those two actually mimic each other's symptoms, and while it might be a little bit odd that he didn't call out for help, if it was a panic attack, you just aren't logical during a panic attack, and if it was a heart attack, he may have not been able to call out for help. A lot of people have the misconception that heart attacks kill you instantly if you're not resuscitated, but heart attacks can range in severity. You can have one where your rhythm is wrong and it's painful and you recognize that you need to get help, but you're not going to die instantaneously. You can also have your heart just straight up stop. Eric could have been the former. You know, once again, it's not a absolute proof that what happened to Eric was a tragic accident, but it's an explanation that can be accepted. It is plausible. So, since there is a plausible explanation, it's rather silly to look for an implausible one. At the end of the day, while these are technically mysteries in that we don't know precisely what happened, they're not inexplicable. Every single one of these could very reasonably have been an accident. Most of David Paulides' arguments in his book are arguments from incredulity, that he can't comprehend that something could have happened, therefore it can't have. Well, yeah, an experienced climber can die high on a mountain. It happens all the time. There are tons of dead Sherpas on Mount Everest. In 2014, there were 6 people, including 2 expert mountain guides, who fell off the side of Mount Rainier and died. Their bodies are possibly unrecoverable. I mean, as I said, at least 84 people have died on Mount Rainier, and not all of them have been recovered. So in this specific case, I don't think that this is a missing 411 cluster. I don't even think this is missing 411. I think this is just tragic mountain accidents that occurred over a span of 60 years. With all of that said, this is usually where I do the outro, but I did promise you some Sasquatch lore. I will tell you that we did fully plan to re-record this entire segment for today's video, but then we ran out of time. So what you're about to see is an excerpt from our 3rd video in our Bigfoot series, which is on it's actually the 2nd video on the Native American legends of Sasquatch. If you want to give that full video a watch or watch what we have in that series so far, we'll have all of those links down in the description for you. With all that said, I will pass you along to myself with slightly longer hair from a couple of months ago. J.W. Burns was a Canadian Indian agent and educator who lived and worked on the Chehalis Reservation up near Vancouver from 1925 to 1941, and then switched over to the nearby Squaw Reservation from 1941 to 1945. These reservations were and still are very close to one another, and both belong to tribes that speak a Salishan language dialect called Halkomelem. Archaeological evidence suggests that these communities have been in British Columbia for between 5 and 10,000 years, and possibly even earlier than that. And what's also very interesting is that they seem to have lived in settled villages for at least the last 4,000 years, which is actually very early for Native American societies. And during his time amongst the Chehalis people, J.W. Burns took the opportunity to learn some things about these legends that he kept hearing of big hairy men living out in the mountains that seemed to be told by native and frontiersmen alike. He recorded 3 specific stories told to him by natives of the region. Specifically, these were a Chehalis man named Peter Williams, a Squaw man by the name of Charlie Victor, and a man named Point from the village of Agassiz. And all 3 told him tales of what their people called Sasquatch, or, in translation, roughly, hairy men. And Burns retold these stories in a 1929 article in Maclean's magazine entitled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants. And the article begins by introducing the subject matter and describing how reports from time to time, covering a period of many years, have come from the hinterlands of the province that hairy giants had been occasionally seen by Indian and white trappers in the mountain fastnesses far from the pathways of civilization. And he laments at how vague the research has been on this and how nobody has been willing to come forward to admit that they have seen this in person and to describe it, which might be something of a little white lie to get people reading the article, as there's been a lot of first-hand accounts of these big hairy men from before that, but that's beside the point. We'll be getting to that in another video, don't worry. And he also notes how the elders, fearing that they would be mocked for sharing these experiences, didn't want to talk to European Americans about it, or European Canadians, because, according to them, the white man don't listen, he make joke of the Indian. But not all of the natives agreed with this sentiment. For example, Peter Williams of the Chehalis Reservation. He told Burns a rather harrowing tale of his encounter, or encounters I should say, with these hairy giant people. Peter's first story took place in 1909, and he said that he was out hunting at the foot of a mountain about a mile from the Chehalis Reservation when he heard this strange grunt off to the side. He turned to look and saw what at first he thought was a large bear, but as he raised his rifle to shoot it, it stood up on 2 legs and turned around to face him. It then let out a piercing yell, leapt down from its boulder, and began to chase Peter, who immediately just booked it. Peter then ran for his canoe, which was sitting in the Chehalis River, while this 6'6" tall, giant, hairy dude is just chasing him the whole way, and gaining. In the limited time Peter had to, look at the thing and gauge how big it was and all of that, he estimated that it was about 6 feet 6 inches tall, which is not particularly impossible, but that is the kind of height that you notice out and about. I don't think I would look at a person who's 6 foot 6 inches tall and go, that's a giant, but I would say, wow, that is a big person. And that is clearly the way Peter thought about this, because he just ran as fast as he could for his canoe, which was sitting at the edge of the Chehalis River. And he got in, pushed himself across, got out, and started running for home yet again. And of course, as he gets into the water, he thinks, oh, well, it won't follow me through here, clearly. But no, our friend the Sasquatch just started wading right through after him. So, of course, Peter's like, yeah, I can't just stay out here, there's a big man following me. So he runs back to his own home, barricades the door, tells his wife and kids, hey, hide under the bed, something's coming, let daddy deal with it. And about 20 minutes after he arrives home and barricades the door and sets up for his home defense session, he hears the sound as loud as the trampling of a horse coming from outside. Peter told J.W. Burns that as it approached, he looked through a crack in the wall of his home and saw that the figure approaching him, this 6 foot 6 inch tall being, was about, double the breadth of a normal man and covered in hair. But aside from that, he said it just looked like a normal human being. But human or not, the attacker started to bash against the walls of Peter's home so aggressively that it actually rocked back and forth, but it just couldn't quite get through. It then spent quite a while grunting and growling and moving about like an animal before eventually walking off. In the morning, when he went out to look around, he found the thing's footprints, which he said were humanoid in shape, but about 22 inches long and rather narrow. The following winter, while duck hunting on the north side of Harrison Lake at a place that the natives called the Prairie, Peter had his second encounter with the hairy man. It once again chased him, but this time it gave up after a few hundred yards, perhaps remembering that last time Peter had actually evaded it. That possibility is actually strengthened by the tale of another person who allegedly, this came through Peter as well, but this other guy, Paul, supposedly had a run-in with the same hairy man later that day, but as he approached his own cabin, it decided to break off the chase, which does suggest that this is something that is intelligent enough to recognize, hey, when they get inside their buildings, they're safe from me. I don't need to waste effort. After his second run-in with the Sasquatch, for some reason or another, Peter was questioned by the elders, and he said that they just kind of nodded sagely and, knew what it was. They basically told Peter, yeah, that's the Sasquatch, don't go near those. Also, we're not going to draw attention to this. As for why they didn't want to draw attention to the issue, probably ties back to that same thing that J.W. Burns heard. The white man don't believe the Indian, he make joke. Peter did see Sasquatch twice more in his life, once while out bear hunting with a companion, and once while fishing with his wife. During the bear hunt, he actually saw 2 of them, one male, one female, and he said that they were nude. Thankfully, neither of them gave chase this time. Then, while he was fishing with his wife, he actually did see the one that had chased him a couple of times before, but thankfully it did not see him and just kind of wandered off into the wilderness. Finally, Peter told Burns that Peter's father had told him stories of wild men living off in the mountains and how, some of them still live off near Agassiz. But he was very clear that these creatures of the mountains, these hairy men, were in no way related to his people, to the Indians, as he said. He said these are not Indians. Burns also spoke to a man by the name of Charlie Victor over at the Squaw Reservation, and he clarified that Charlie Victor was known as one of the best hunters in his band in his youth. And Charlie had 2 main stories of the Sasquatch. One was about their home, and then the other was about their mannerisms and social behaviors. And according to J.W. Burns' article, he used the term Sasquatch. That's what he called them. And he described them as a strange people of whom there are but very few now, rarely seen and seldom met. In the first of Charlie's stories, he and some companions were out picking salmon berries on a mountain slope, a rocky mountain slope, 5 or 6 miles from the old town of Yale, as he says. And this is possibly Mount Fagervik. While there, they came across a large opening or cave in the mountainside, and they felt this was odd because they had been picking berries and hunting and trapping and all of that on these mountainsides for their entire lives, for many years. They knew these places like the back of their hands, and they had never seen that cave before. And Charlie said, outside the mouth of the cave, there was an enormous boulder. We peered into the cavity, but couldn't see anything. So they gathered wood to make some torches and made their way into the cavern, at which point they discovered that not all that far in seemed to be an enclosure or perhaps a house made out of stone. It was crude, but it did look to be man-made. And they wanted to keep exploring and figure out, what's going on here, what is this, but their torches kept going out, so they decided, we'll leave and we'll come back another time better prepared. But upon hearing this, the elders went back to Charlie and his friends and they said, hey, you can't go back there. That's surely the lair of the Sasquatch. You cannot be there. But Charlie and his buddies, being young men who just discovered a Sasquatch cave, which is something they didn't even know existed up until that point, they decided they were going back. However, when they returned, they found that enormous boulder, which he had said was, it looked almost too perfectly round, like it was meant to be used as a door or something. Well, he was right, because that boulder was rolled in front of the cave entrance and they couldn't get back in. Now, Charlie didn't want to give up on the cave thing entirely, and he expressed to Burns that if he ever had the money, he would have loved to go back and bring dynamite to blow it open and really explore in there and figure out what was going on. And I think at the beginning of this I said that there were 2 stories that Charlie had. There's actually 3. So this is the next one, which took place 20 years after the cave incident. He was bathing one day in a small lake near Yale with some other people when he just, out of the corner of his eye, saw something behind a rock. He stared at it for a second, and then he watched as a big, hairy man sort of just crept out from behind the rock, looked at him, and then walked away. Charlie said that its eyes were so kind-looking that he was actually going to speak to it. He wanted to say something, but then it just sort of wandered off. 2 weeks later, he and some others were doing the same thing, just hanging out at the lake, when they once again saw the hairy man off in the woods, but this time, rather than getting close and, making eye contact with any of them, it just ran off toward the mountain. And when he says the mountain, I kind of assume contextually that he means the one where he saw the opening in the wall. The third experience that Charlie recounted happened about 15 years before he spoke to J.W. Burns, so we're going to talk about probably 1914 here. And Charlie described this experience as a disagreeable meeting and a tragedy from which he had not yet fully recovered. He was out hunting in the mountains near Hatzik when he came upon a plateau covered in large cedar trees. And at one of these cedar trees, his dog alerted, so it walked over and it was pawing at it and essentially asking, hey. Charlie was curious why the dog was so interested in this tree, and he looked up and found that about 7 feet up, there was a large hole, and so he put the dog into the hole. It's not clear exactly what kind of dog this is, or what kind of hunting method this is, but I'm not going to question it because I honestly don't know enough about hunting to do so. After a moment, he heard a muffled cry and then some scuffling around and assumed that the dog had found a bear. So he called the dog out, hoping that the bear would follow it, and he would just be waiting there with his rifle to take the shot. The dog proceeded to drive out what Charlie Victor assumed was a small bear and promptly shot. But when he looked at what he had shot, it turned out that, in fact, it appeared to be a 12 or 14-year-old boy. This boy was nude, he appeared to have white skin, like European white skin, and he had woolly black hair. Before Charlie could do anything, the boy let out a wild yell, which Charlie said was as if he were appealing for help, and a booming voice responded from across the mountain. The boy would continue calling, and he would continue getting a response, but each response was slightly closer than the last. And after less than half an hour, according to Charlie, a hairy creature walked out of the forest and approached him without the slightest fear. And whatever this creature in front of him was, he could tell immediately that it was female, that its skin appeared to be dark, and that it had long, straight hair which cascaded down to its waist. Charlie estimated that the wild woman he was seeing was about 6 feet tall, and aside from being rather hairy, she looked normal for a human with one main exception. She was unusually broad in the chest and shoulders. Charlie also told Burns that he had seen several wild men in his life, but this one was by far the most savage in appearance, and upon seeing it, he was genuinely in fear for his life. The old native even continued, saying, "In my time, I have in more than one emergency strangled a bear with my hands, but I'm sure that if that wild woman laid hands on me, she'd break every bone in my body." Now, I know that there are some of you who in the comments will write something along the lines of Bigfoot muscle mommy. And you know what? Go ahead. In any case, the wild woman then turned to Charlie and spoke, and he was very surprised to find that he completely understood what she was saying. He said that she spoke the language of the Douglas people, an interior Salish group who are local or were local to the area at the northern end of Harrison Lake. Charlie himself was half Douglas, or more properly, the Hawkshaw people, so he knew the language well enough to converse, and what she said to him was, "You have shot my friend." Charlie was immediately apologetic, saying, "I'm sorry, it was an accident, I thought he was a bear," all because he's looking at the wild woman and he felt fear at the anger he saw in her face. I would imagine that fear only intensified because she didn't actually respond. She just started to dance in a circle around the boy, shouting out a chant and the word Yahoo repeatedly, all while taking what appeared to be some form of rope. He thought that maybe it was made of animal intestines, that was about 6 feet long, and whacking it on the ground as she danced around the boy. And all through this performance, as she's chanting Yahoo, Yahoo, he's hearing other voices chanting from the forest, Yahoo, Yahoo. Then she just picked the boy up like he was a little wax doll and carried him. And Charlie said that as she picked the boy up and got ready to walk away, she said, "Siwash, you will never kill another bear." And Charlie, for the rest of his life, did not kill another bear. In fact, he never shot another animal. And he says that as this all happened, as she was, saying goodbye and all of that, he just got this sudden wave of exhaustion, and he couldn't even hold his rifle up. He just, kind of lost all of his energy. He was paralyzed with fear. Now, as for that term Siwash that the wild person used when it spoke to Charlie, I found a few different definitions. The one from dictionary.com, which is the one that I'm going to trust the most here, says that it has two essential meanings, one of which is a disparaging term for an indigenous American person. And from what I was seeing, the term came out of Chinook jargon. It came out of a sort of a mixed language of European languages like English and French, and the Pacific Northwest Native American languages. This came about as a result of trade between all of these different groups who needed to understand each other. And it seems that it came from the French sauvage, which I guess in context meant wild. As a verb, however, the word means to camp without a tent or supplies, basically wild camping. In addition to that, there is a Siwash Creek north of Yale, British Columbia, along the Fraser River, so it could have been in reference to that. But, as I said, I was unable to be certain about this term, but it seems like it's probably relevant to the story in some way or another. For example, if this wild person was using the Chinook jargon terminology, if they were calling him, a derogatory term for a Native American, well, that would imply that it wasn't a Native American, that it was something else, someone who viewed these people as others, and someone who at least viewed this specific one negatively. Charlie also said that this wild person was darker skinned than the ones he had encountered previously, and that looking at the very white-skinned boy, he figured that boy probably was not one of them, and was either kidnapped or adopted, acquired in some way or another from a different group, and they were raising him as one of their own. And of course she had called the boy friend rather than son or child or something like that, implying a non-familial connection. However, it was Charlie's opinion that because these guys spoke the Douglas language, they must be, in some form or another, related to the Douglas people. I guess it is possible that the word Siwash meant something different in the Douglas language, but then why not translate it as he did the rest of the sentence? It seems that he very intentionally put that word there. And I know I'm harping on it. I don't particularly know why he would have done this, but again, I know that some people in the audience know more about certain topics than I do, so if any of you do, please let me know your thoughts on that. And the last of Burns' informants was a man who simply went by the name of Point. He had lived in the village of Agassiz, which is where this encounter had happened, and he said that it happened in 1927, 2 years before Burns' article came out. It was the end of September, and the village was preparing for an annual hops harvest festival. They would have a feast every year to celebrate this harvest. Point said that he was walking with a girl by the name of Adeline August through her father's orchard, which he said was located about 4 miles from the hop fields and along the Canadian Pacific Railway tracks. And Adeline was the first to notice that something was coming towards them walking along the tracks, and at first she thought, oh, well, that's just a person coming towards Agassiz, they're probably going to be participating in the festival, that's all. But as they got closer and closer, about within 50 feet, they realized that something was off about this person. The man was naked and covered in hair, quote, like an animal, and most importantly, he was twice as big as the average man, with hands so long they almost touched the ground. Point also said that the thing's face was a little different from ours, that the nose was very broad, covering much of the face, and that the eyes were very large. Point said that at first he and Adeline were both paralyzed with fear, but then they quickly came to their senses and bolted towards the village. However, the giant, whatever it was, didn't chase them, it just kinda wandered off back towards the mountains. And of course, when they went to tell the elders what they had seen, and it was more that they were just telling the story out in the open and some of the elders heard, they said that Point had clearly run into one of the Sasquatch, and that those were a tribe of hairy people who the elders claim have always lived in the mountains in tunnels and caves. So what we see is that in each Sasquatch story recounted by Burns, the elders are well aware that these things exist, that they live in caves, and that they advise people not to go near them. And in each story, the Sasquatch only seem to become violent when threatened or provoked. Peter Williams raised a rifle at one, Charlie Victor shot one of their friends, and Point, who did not in any way provoke the thing, it just left them alone. Of course, Burns is not the only person who has described the Bigfoot-like lore of the Sasquatch of the Salish peoples, but unfortunately, the other academic and journalistic sources are extraordinarily limited. That said, according to S. Michelle Rasmus, the Salishan Lumi people of Washington have stories of what they call semiquests, or big bones. Unfortunately, Rasmus tells us literally nothing about these legends besides the fact that they vary from storyteller to storyteller. I won't go into why she does that, but it's something that really bugs me about modern academics, especially in history. Then, in a BBC article entitled The True Origin of Sasquatch by Elisa Cadane, Chehalis Band Council member Kelsey Charlie is quoted as giving his explanation of the Sasquatch legend. He says that the name derives from Sasket's Tell, which is where the Saskets or Sasquatch gather, and that everybody paid reverence to the emblem of our nation, which is the Sasquatch. This does contradict the accounts given by Burns in some ways, and he goes on to describe Sasquatch a little bit differently. He says that this is a sort of shapeshifter, and it's a spiritual being who protects the forest. But he also says that at one point he saw some of them drinking from the creek or from the lake. So it's, I guess, spiritual beings, shapeshifters, more than a singular figure. Or possibly there are two different Bigfoot here. There are two different Sasquatch, one that is a spiritual being and one that is a tribe of wild men. Or we're just getting two different sources and only one of them is right. And because accounts from the early contact period, when these stories had the greatest amount of integrity to what they originally were, because those sources are so vague, it's really hard to determine who's correct. On the one hand, Kelsey Charlie is himself a member of a Salishan band. He grew up on these stories, and you'd expect him to know his stuff. However, as we saw with the stuff that Taylor Tupper said, where she talked about Matakagni, who I could only find in one account from a guy who was by no means a Native American, and the fact that she said Site Ka was what the Paiute called these people, I have to point out that just because you're part of a culture doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to know all of the details about what people who lived before you believed. I mean, just look at the way that Irish Americans and Irish people celebrate St. Patrick's Day and how they conceive of being Irish. There are, growing up in a culture does not necessarily mean that you fully understand all aspects of it. Many of you who watch the channel are probably Christian, but I bet you couldn't recite the Gospels. It's the same kind of thing. Generally, you want to listen and you want to understand and you want to bring that information in and seriously consider it, but it's important to not leave oral legend, oral storytelling at its face value. You should always look to compare and contrast sources from every angle so that you get the most complete picture. And the reason I say that is because, on the other hand, J.W. Burns lived amongst these people. He learned specifically about these stories. He was targeting this. What is this? Tell me about this specific thing. Explain this aspect of your lore to me. And, the guy was trained as some form of educator. So it is possible that J.W. Burns, with access to those people telling him these stories directly from a much earlier time period, could have the better information. As I said, it's really difficult to ascertain who is more correct here because of the lack of records. So what we can do is look at the surrounding area and the tribes that are not Salishan themselves, the ones that are simply related, or perhaps ones that are Salishan but from a different region. Because a lot of their stories do fall in line with this Saskets as Sasquatch as wild man idea. So I think that you can probably see why my opinion on Sasquatch is that if Sasquatch is real, it's probably another tribe of humans, but there's more on that in that series, which I highly recommend you go watch, mostly because I put a lot of time into it. I worked very hard. I was up really late several nights, like till 4. And interestingly enough, a lot of those Sasquatch stories, as was mentioned there, do involve people being snatched. So while I think David Paulides is probably wrong about most of the missing 411 cases involving Sasquatch, I would not be entirely shocked if some of the missing 411 cases were abductions. Whether it was by Bigfoot or not, that's for you to decide, but I do think that there are some of these that very well could have been abductions. And possibly even by people living out in the wild, because while that's not a super common thing, and feral people and the idea of like Deliverance, or even that episode of American Horror Stories, which just copied my entire theory a few years ago, hey, thanks guys. I don't think it's to that scale, but there are some pretty credible reports of either small family units or individuals living out in America's wildlands. We'll come to that a little bit later in the Bigfoot series, actually. So anyway, if you enjoyed the video you saw here today, you can support the Lore Lodge by subscribing to our YouTube channel, becoming a member of our YouTube channel, or subscribing to our Patreon. You can do both for just $1 a month, though there are higher tiers. We also have several other channels, The Weird Bible, The History Hut, my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, and we've got a couple of other things in the works that'll be Aiden and I, but the really exciting news is that we're building new channels for our network here. You might notice the background behind me is different. That's because we just moved into a much larger, very expensive studio space that we're using to bring you not even more Lodge at this point. We're gonna have shows about the music industry, the service industry, the mental health, barbering even. And part of the reason we ran out of time to shoot that Sasquatch lore segment is that right about now, actually, we're bringing in one of those new hosts to record an episode of his show. That's going to be Off the Record with Luke Eccles. It's going to be a show interviewing people in the music industry, going to shows and recording what the process is like. It's going to be really cool, but the podcast is going to be live very soon, and those will be recorded episodes on his channel. Once there's a link to that channel, we promise you will know about it. Another thing you need to know about is the fact that we do still have slots available for our trip to Alaska. That is, if you're seeing this video before May 26th, the deadline to sign up. For those interested in coming on a 7-day hiking and camping expedition in Alaska with Aiden and myself, you can head over to the link in the description for Trova Trip. It'll be nice and labeled for you. And while that price point may look a little daunting, I understand it was in fact the lowest we could possibly get it and still cover our costs. You can pay for it in installments. You can do a 25% down payment, and then you'll have an Affirm plan for 6, 12, or 18 months. It's actually a pretty reasonable payment plan, and personally, I'm super excited about the trip. I hope that a bunch of you guys can come, and I think we're gonna make some pretty cool memories. We also are finalizing our agreement with Bunker Branding to bring you a whole new series of much higher quality, better designed, and most importantly, American-made merch for the Lore Lodge. We also do the Lore Lodge as a live show every Sunday evening at 7 p.m., unless there's like a holiday or something like that, in which case we will inform you in advance. And during football season, sometimes the shows vary at time of day because we're Birds fans. Go Birds. We also do have a live program called The Lore Lads, where Aiden and I sit down and talk about all this stuff, and also bring in guests every 2 weeks to talk about things that we've talked about in the past, or what someone else is passionate about in this space. We have guys like The Missing Enigma, Roanoke Gaming. In my opinion, some pretty good guests. One of the ways that we stay hopped up for our insane schedules, at which we're working like 20 hours a day, it's fun work, but it's a lot of work, is that we drink our own coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. We designed it, it's delicious, it's real coffee, I didn't pick it off the shelf. I told Matt from Tableau, hey, I want these flavor profiles and I want beans from these places at these elevations. So it's good coffee. I was a barista at an artisan roastery for many years. And finally, if you want to keep up with what we're doing and engage with our community, you can join our Discord at bit.ly/jointhelodge. I will tell you right now, it's a community, all right. The way I would describe it is it's vibrant. But yeah, I love them. I love our community, but it is a vibrant community. There are some conversations in there. All right, with all of that covered, I'm Aiden Mattis. I hope you enjoyed the content today. I'd like to thank our friends over at Babbel for sponsoring this video, and thank you for stopping by the Lore Lodge.